It was one of those weeknights where nothing especially bad happened. Not good either. Just normal. I was sitting in my car outside my place, engine still running, radio off, phone face down on the seat. I noticed I'd been there a while, longer than usual. I wasn't avoiding going inside. I was replaying the day, not the big stuff, the small stuff. Moments where things almost stalled and I nudged them forward with money. Lunch that went a little long because I picked up the check. A ride share instead of waiting. Dinner ordered in so nobody had to decide anything. None of it felt like spending. It felt like lubrication, like keeping the day from grinding to a stop. I remember thinking, without really finishing the thought, I guess this is just what it costs to keep things moving. At the time, that felt reasonable, almost responsible, like I was being efficient with my life. Sitting there in the car, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd paid for motion more than anything else. Not progress, just motion. And I hadn't really looked at what that motion was costing me. I used to be the guy who grabbed the check before it landed fully on the table. Not dramatically, just early enough to avoid the pause. That little silence when everyone pretends to look for their wallet at the same time. I hated that moment more than I hated spending the money. So I'd say, I got this like it was nothing. Like it didn't count. In my head, it always evened out eventually. Someone else would get the next one. Or it was my turn. Or I'd had a good month. But months don't remember dinners. They just remember totals. A couple times a week turns into 4 or 5. $40 here. 60 there. Before you know it, that's $300 in a month just to keep meals pleasant. What gets me is how little I remember those nights. Not the food, not the conversations, just the feeling that nothing got awkward. I didn't think of it as generosity or pressure. It was just the cost of keeping the table warm. I told myself it was fine, and technically it was, until I started noticing how often fine showed up on my statement. There was a stretch where I stopped waiting for things almost entirely, not consciously. It just felt outdated. If the train was 10 minutes out, I'd open an app. If parking looked annoying, I'd pay for something closer. If walking felt like it might slow the group down, I'd cover a ride. $18 here, $12 there. Amount small enough to dismiss, big enough to add up quietly. I told myself I was buying time. But if I'm honest, I wasn't in a rush. I just didn't want to be the reason things paused. Waiting started to feel like friction, like something you inflicted on other people. Once a week became twice. Twice became normal. By the end of the month, I was looking at over $100 spent just to avoid standing still. What made it uncomfortable wasn't the number. It was realizing I'd paid to preserve momentum that wasn't actually going anywhere. I didn't remember arriving faster. I just remembered that nobody sighed, and that felt worth paying for, at least at the time. Food delivery snuck in the same way, not because I was craving anything specific, but because ordering kept the night intact. No debating where to go, no dishes, no one losing interest while decisions dragged on. So I'd tap a few buttons and feel the room relax. $25 for something I could have made. $30 after fees and tip. It didn't feel like dinner money. It felt like conflict avoidance. Once or twice a week didn't register. But once or twice a week turns into a lot when you stretch it out over a year. Over $1,200 just like that. What bothered me wasn't that I spent it. It was that I barely noticed doing it. Most of those meals blur together. I can't tell you what I ordered, but I remember the feeling of things staying smooth. I told myself I was paying for convenience. Later, it hit me that I was really paying, so nothing had to stop or change. And that's when it started to feel heavier than food. Subscriptions were different. They didn't feel like momentum. They felt like insurance against interruption. $10 here, $15 there, nothing big enough to argue with. Canceling always felt like hitting a wall, like admitting something was over. So I'd leave them on, just in case. I told myself I might use them again, or that I'd deal with it later. Later turned into months. When I finally looked, there were services I hadn't opened in half a year. Music I wasn't listening to. Shows I'd already finished. Tools I'd needed once. Individually, they were harmless. Together, they were loud. Around $90 a month. Over $1,000 a year. To keep doors open I wasn't walking through. What made it uncomfortable was realizing how much I'd paid to avoid deciding. Not to enjoy anything, just to keep options alive. It wasn't wasteful, it was passive, and that somehow felt worse. Upgrades always sounded reasonable. $5 more for faster, 10 more for extra storage, a little extra for premium. I rarely questioned them. Annoyance felt like a flaw I should fix quickly. So I did. Again and again. Better internet so videos wouldn't buffer. More cloud space so I wouldn't have to clean things up. Ad-free versions so nothing broke my rhythm. Each one felt tiny, but they stacked. 20 here, 30 there, across apps, services, plans. I never noticed things getting better. I just noticed not being irritated. That was the part I didn't want to look at first. How much I was paying not for improvement, but for the absence of friction. I told myself it was optimization, but sometimes it felt like I was just buying silence. And silence isn't free. I became the default driver without ever agreeing to it. It just sort of happened. I had the car. I was on the way anyway. It was easier if I went. Gas wasn't something anyone talked about. It was just there like background noise. So I filled up more often. Once a week instead of every other. $40, $50 at a time. I told myself it was fine. I liked being reliable. I liked it that plans didn't fall apart because of me. But when I actually looked at it, that was $200 a month. Almost $2,500 a year. All to keep things moving. To make sure nobody had to rethink the plan. What made it uncomfortable wasn't that anyone asked me to do it. It was that I offered, automatically. I paid for momentum with gas money. And I never once framed it that way in my head. Credit cards made everything smoother, too smooth. I'd swipe or tap without slowing down, no pause, no mental math. I told myself I'd deal with it later. That next month would be lighter. That it wasn't real money yet. There wasn't one big purchase that did the damage. Just 100 small ones that didn't feel like anything. When interest showed up, it felt random. Like a penalty I hadn't earned. But it was just the price of not stopping. A balance of $3,000 at 20% doesn't sound dramatic until you see the math. That's $600 a year just to keep things moving forward without friction. What bothered me was how invisible that cost felt at the time. No awkward moment, no discomfort, just quiet money leaving in the background. And I let it. There were a lot of little I'll get this moments that never fully closed. Covering a ticket, front in cash, sending money so the plan didn't stall. Nobody ever said they wouldn't pay me back. We just didn't circle back to it, and I didn't push. Pushing felt like rewinding the moment, like breaking whatever rhythm we were in. So $20 here went unreturned, then $30, then a couple bigger ones that I stopped keeping track of. I told myself it wasn't worth the awkward follow-up, that I'd rather lose a little money than create tension. But when I finally added it up, roughly $200 a month drifting out without a clear path back, it hit harder than I expected. Not because of the money, because of how casually I let it go. I wasn't being generous. I was paying to avoid a conversation. And that felt like a strange thing to budget for, even unconsciously. Parking is one of those things that feels too small to matter. $5, $8, sometimes $15 if it was close. I almost never chose the free option if it meant walking farther. Walking felt like falling behind, so I paid, every time. A couple times a week adds up fast. $60 a month without thinking about it. $700 a year just so I could arrive already in motion. What got uncomfortable was realizing how automatic it had become. I didn't even look for alternatives. I wasn't paying for convenience anymore. I was paying to keep my pace. To not feel like the guy lagging behind the plan. Standing there at the parking meter once, waiting for the receipt to print, I had this quiet thought that surprised me. I wasn't buying space for my car. I was buying permission not to slow down. And that felt heavier than the ticket itself. Rounds at the bar worked the same way. Not about drinking, about energy. There's a moment in the night where things could wind down naturally, or you can buy another round and keep it alive. I almost always chose the second one. Not because I wanted another drink. Half the time I didn't. But buying a round felt like saying, we're still here, don't stop yet. So I'd put my card down. $40, sometimes more. Once in a while felt harmless, but once in a while turned into once a week. Then twice. By the end of the year, it was well over $1,000 spent on drinks I barely remember drinking. What bothered me wasn't the money. It was the realization that I was using it like a signal. A way to tell the night to keep going without asking anyone if they actually wanted that. I paid to avoid the quiet moment where things might end on their own. And I never really asked myself why that felt so uncomfortable. Work had its own version of this. Small expenses I just covered myself. Printing something last minute, grabbing supplies, paying for software so I wouldn't have to ask IT. Submitting a reimbursement felt like slowing everything down, like being difficult. So I didn't. $10 here, $20 there, nothing worth an email. Except it happened a lot. By the time I actually added it up, it was a few $100s a year. Not catastrophic, just quietly gone. What made it sting was realizing what I'd paid for. Not productivity, not better work. I paid to look easy, low maintenance. Someone who kept things moving. I never told myself that's what I was doing. I told myself it wasn't worth the hassle. But money has a way of keeping track, even when you don't. Gifts started to feel like another way to keep momentum. Birthdays, housewarmings, thank yous that came up fast. I didn't slow down to think much about them. I just bought something decent enough to move on. A bottle of wine, a gift card, something safe. It wasn't about generosity. It was about timing. Showing up with something so the moment didn't get weird. $50 here, $75 there, nothing outrageous on its own. But over a year, it crossed $1,000 pretty easily. What sat heavy wasn't the spending. It was how little meaning there was in most of it. I couldn't remember what I gave. I just remembered relief. Relief that I hadn't shown up empty-handed, that I hadn't slowed the moment down. I told myself it was part of being an adult. Later, it felt more like another fee for staying in rhythm. I also stopped fixing things earlier than I needed to, replacing instead of repairing, upgrading instead of waiting, a cracked screen, a battery that still worked, just not well, shoes that were fine but annoying. Fixing felt like delay. Replacement felt clean. So I'd spend the money and move on. $200 here, $300 there. It wasn't reckless, it was efficient. Until I noticed how often efficient showed up on my card. Replacing things early didn't just cost more once. It reset the clock every time. What made it uncomfortable was realizing I wasn't buying better stuff. I was buying impatience relief. I didn't want to deal with small annoyances. So I paid to erase them. And I never asked how much that erasing added up to over time. Late fees always felt like accidents. Something that happened to other people. Until they didn't. A bill paid a few days late. A subscription renewal I forgot about. A ticket I meant to deal with later. I'd see the fee and feel annoyed, but not surprised. Like it was the cost of being busy. $10, $25, sometimes more. I told myself it wasn't a pattern, just life happening. But when I finally looked back over a year, those little penalties added up to a few $100s. Money spent not on anything useful. Just on staying in motion while time kept moving whether I noticed or not. What made it uncomfortable was realizing I wasn't paying because I forgot. I was paying because I didn't stop. Stopping felt disruptive, so I paid the toll and kept going. Flexible tickets felt smart, refundable flights, cancelable reservations, plans that could change without consequences. I liked knowing I could move if I needed to, that nothing was locking me in. So I paid extra. Usually $30 or $40 more, sometimes a lot more. Most of the time, nothing changed. I didn't cancel. I didn't reschedule. The flexibility just sat there unused. By the end of the year, I'd spent a few $100s on options I never exercised. Money spent on hypothetical movement. What stuck with me was how calming it felt in the moment. Like I'd bought myself permission to stay loose. Later, it felt like I'd paid for a future that never arrived. Just so the present didn't feel tight. There were moments I used money to avoid conversations. Not big ones. Small, uncomfortable ones. Paying instead of asking. Covering something instead of explaining. Spending to smooth over tension before it showed up. It felt kind, it felt easier. But it didn't actually resolve anything. It just postponed it. Those moments didn't have a clear price tag. But when I looked back, they showed up everywhere. Meals. Trips, small fixes that weren't mine to fix. I wasn't solving problems, I was delaying them with cash. What made that realization heavy was seeing how often I chose silence over clarity, and how much that silence cost over time. This was the part I didn't want to look at first. When I finally stacked it all together, delivery, rides, gas, upgrades, fees, little covers, it landed somewhere around $600 a month. Not one thing, everything. $600 just to keep things moving, to avoid pauses, to smooth moments, to stay in rhythm. That number didn't make me panic. It made me quiet because none of it felt wrong when it happened. It felt normal, responsible even. Seeing it together didn't come with a solution, just a weight. Like realizing how much effort goes into standing still without noticing. What messes with me is how ordinary all of it was. No splurges, no wild mistakes. Just small choices layered on top of each other. Choices made to keep life flowing. I never felt reckless. I felt cooperative, easygoing, low friction. But normal has a price when it's always moving forward without asking where it's going. I didn't set out to spend that money. I just didn't stop it. And that gap between intention and outcome, that's the part that lingers. Not guilt, not regret. Just a quiet awareness that momentum isn't free. When I broke it down further, it came out to about $20 a day. That's it. 20. Not enough to argue with. Not enough to notice most days, but heavy enough when you realize what it's attached to. I think about that number sometimes. Usually when I'm about to pay for something small to keep things smooth. Not to stop myself, just to notice. $20 a day to keep things moving. And some days, I'm still not sure where they're moving to.